Everyone on Twitter was talking about the sushi mansion last night, so I hope you had a good time.
Welcome into another D3 Datacast. If you're joining us on YouTube, click the subscribe button to stay up to date with the channel. Click the thumbs up button if you just happen to like this episode. If you're joining us on our audio-only podcast version, could you give us a review? If you need a recommendation of how many stars to give us, we could certainly give that recommendation. Let us know if you need that. And if you'd like to support us at an even greater level, head to patreon.com/D3Datacast for more information there, how you can do that. Matt, in the words of Bill Belichick, we're on to Fort Wayne.
He said that. He said that about Fort Wayne, didn't he?
Yeah. Or Cincinnati, but close enough. All right, we are down to our Final Four, Matthew. So let's talk about what happened this past weekend. Starting in our first quadrant, hosted at Hampton-Sydney. They've been the top seed in this quadrant of the bracket. Hosted in the opening weekend, hosting in the second weekend. Matt, that first game at Hampton-Sydney in the Sweet 16 round, Nebraska Wesleyan gets a 74-70 win over Claremont Mudscripts. Then in the nightcap, host Hampton-Sydney rolls to a 91-76 win over Rowan. They jumped out early in that one. And then in the sectional final, Hampton-Sydney gets a 68-60 win over Nebraska Wesleyan to punch their ticket to the Final Four.
Yeah, congrats to Hampton-Sydney. I think they're a very deserving Final Four team. I think they were one of the favorites. Definitely our computer odds the whole way have been giving them high odds to advance to the Final Four, and we see them getting there here. So I think we expected Hampton-Sydney. We don't always see the teams that we expect in the Final Four weekend. This is definitely one of them, though. For me, jumping up to that Friday night Sweet 16 game, you mentioned the final scores there. Nebraska Wesleyan 74, Claremont Mudscripts 70. That final score, I think, feels pretty close. I don't know that the whole game was actually that close. It feels like Nebraska Wesleyan had Claremont Mudscripts almost at arm's reach the whole thing. Kind of like, it felt like more of like a 10-point game most of the way, but credit to Claremont Mudscripts. They really battled the last few minutes of the game to get that down. I think they had it down to 3. The final margin was 4. They didn't quite ever have the ball. Claremont Mudscripts, that is. I don't think they ever quite had the ball with a chance to maybe tie. But they really did fight hard. Credit to them. Credit to Nebraska Wesleyan for winning that game, getting to the Elite 8 round. Hampton-Sydney, though, like I said, I think showed themselves to be very much one of the favorites in that game. They really handled Rowan the night before on Friday, and then with Nebraska Wesleyan, they really jumped out to a lead. I think they held that lead most of the game, really. I think 10 or 12 points in the second half. I think maybe as many as 15 in the second half. Again, Nebraska Wesleyan cuts into that lead a little bit at the end to make it look like an 8-point margin. It was a final 8-point margin, but I don't really think in my mind Nebraska Wesleyan was ever really a serious threat late in that game they were always a few possessions away from making that happen and couldn't quite put it together. So Hampton-Sydney is, I think, where we thought they were going to be coming into the tournament. Just looking back at what our pre-tournament odds said about them, I think they were a 62% chance to reach the Final Four. Those are huge odds considering you have to win 4 games to get here against mostly other good teams.
Teams, yeah.
62% chance, and they hit that. They're here. They're going to Fort Wayne. We'll see them next weekend, so congrats to Hampton-Sydney. I think well-deserved.
They bested it, Matt. It's now 100%.
100% to get there.
Yeah. Hey, going back to that Nebraska Wesleyan CMS game, like both teams came out really firing early on. That felt, through much of that first half, like that was going to be a game played in the 80s and 90s. So a little bit interesting to see the final score of 74-70, given the way that played out. But yeah, Hampton-Sydney keeps it rolling, Matt. I mean, we talked about it last weekend, how heavy of a favorite they entered the tournament, at least in terms of getting to the Final Four and also having the overall best odds to win the championship. That first weekend certainly did nothing to draw any question or put any doubt in anyone's mind that's the case. And I think they're rolling into the Final Four with that still being the case. Like you mentioned, even though it looks like just an 8-point win over Nebraska Wesleyan, the way they've handled business, that looks to be like maybe the number one freight train heading into Fort Wayne. Yeah. We'll see what happens from here on out. Things can, in the tournaments, have a way of flipping from weekend to weekend, but that certainly has not been the case with Hampton-Sydney so far through the first 2 weekends.
Yeah, I think the only, maybe not a knock against Hampton-Sydney at all. The only thing you could say maybe about their tournament path is they haven't, just the way things have fallen out, they haven't had to play the toughest of competition of teams that we see remaining. I think maybe they're just by like the computer ratings number. Their game against Rowan was maybe the toughest number. Nebraska Wesleyan also in the top 30. We've seen teams now have to play like several top 10 type teams. I don't know that Hampton City's had to do that yet. Now they played in the ODAC, so we know that they're a battle tested team. So far, their tournament path, they've beaten the teams in front of them. They've beaten good teams. I don't know that they've had to beat a nationally elite, what I would think of as a nationally elite team yet, though.
And that's where you have to look at some of the margins
Yeah,
and
right.
just the way the games have played out, right? Like even that Rowan game, it's a 15-point win, but they jumped out to a pretty good lead early, right? And it's not like it was slowly building up to that 15-point lead, right? They're jumping out. They were coming out ready to play, looking very impressive right from the start.
For
So
sure,
you're right.
absolutely.
We'll see what happens, but that that level of competition is going to be going up in the Final Four, but maybe it's to their benefit. There's a little bit of familiarity, but we'll get to that because Matt, in that second quadrant on that side of the bracket, hosted at Guilford, Christopher Newport beats Williams in the opening game on Friday, 60-49. And then host Guilford gets a 22-point win, Matt, over Keene State, 82-60. Guilford, back down in a lower scoring game, gets a 50-48 win over Christopher Newport in the sectional final. Guilford giving the ODAC a Final Four sweep on that left-hand side of the bracket. They will face their conference rival Hampton-Sydney in a semifinal in Fort Wayne.
Yeah, not ultimately that surprising. We've been talking about the ODAC since November, I think, being one of the top leagues. Getting two teams to the Final Four, I don't think that we're entirely surprised. I don't know that we would have bet on that, but it was definitely one of the rather decently probabilistic events that could have happened. I think Guilford was very impressive this weekend. The way that they were able to handle Keene State, I think we called that the game of the week last week, if I was correct. We expected a battle. It didn't really end up that way. Guilford was able to really just handle the Owls. We thought that was one of the best Sweet 16 matchups, but they really took it to them. Credit to the Quakers. I think they proved a lot to a lot of people in that game that they're not just necessarily second or third fiddle in the ODAC, thinking of Hampton Sydney and Randolph-Macon. They're one of these national contender type teams. Keene State was a popular pick to advance to the Final Four out of this bracket, maybe between them and Guilford, and the Quakers really, really handled them. I think Christopher Newport, though, in this pod was also very impressive. I think they had a great tournament. They were kind of a wild card coming into the whole tournament. We didn't really know what they were going to do. They had been up and down all season. Players had been in and out. There were injuries. There were other types of situations with their roster. We even saw that they had an injury last week of a very important player. That I don't think was able to play this weekend, but they beat a very good Williams team in the Sweet 16. They gave Guilford everything they could handle a week after, a night after I just said Guilford handled Keene State. Christopher Newport, I think, showed themselves that they weren't just one or two players, right? They weren't just Trey Barber last year. He was a good player, but they have a lot of other good players. That's a good program. They're a good team, and they were able to mount a really big challenge. I think they had a lead late, maybe 2.5 minutes on Guilford. They were very nearly a Final Four repeat team. So Christopher Newport did really impress me this tournament as well, getting to the Elite Eight, challenging in the Elite Eight, nearly getting back to the Final Four. So credit to the captains. Zach, looking at this graphic we have on the screen here, interesting. You've highlighted in red some of the quote-unquote larger upsets of the weekend. Look to that Sweet 16 weekend. Christopher Newport over Williams was one of the bigger upsets we had on that night, and it was basically a 50-50-ish type game. We ended up having a fair bit of what the computers saw as chalk on Friday night in the Sweet 16, but Christopher Newport over Williams was something that was just under 50-50 odds here, but the captains hit on that one.
Go back to November, Matt, coming into the season. It would be no surprise if you were to fast forward to see that Christopher Newport was playing in an Elite Eight game against an ODAC opponent. Yeah. But this was surprising. If you go into like January, I don't think we would have picked Christopher Newport to be in this spot.
No.
Go back to coming into the season, we thought maybe they would be here, but it would be with this veteran team that has all this championship experience. And then you talked about, just for a variety of reasons, how different of a team this turned out to be in this spot. And so now I think you have to look at this as a team that made a run to the Elite Eight as a very young team, and the good things that that means going forward. Of course, being led by a returning player like John Hines,
Mm-hmm.
still in this tournament run, certainly helps. But this is a team that had to get a lot of contributions from freshmen, very young players, and so in a lot of ways it was a season of turmoil. But the outlook, I think, very much looks favorable for Christopher Newport moving forward.
Yeah, you always wonder. Dumb people like me always wonder, right? All right, is this a good group of players, and that's why they're winning, or is it a good program that, of course, still has a lot of good players, but it's not just a couple of seniors or a couple of players that are maybe going to graduate next year, but do they have that next wave coming in? I think a game like this shows that maybe that certainly is the case for Christopher Newport. They weren't just a good group of players last year. They have a good program with other players coming in and coming through, and they're a team, a program that we expect to be in the mix in most years going forward.
All right, so congratulations to the Guilford Quakers. Moving on to the Final Four. Matt, another quadrant of the bracket to look at here was hosted at Trine. UW Platteville gets a 20-point win over Case Western Reserve in the first game on Friday, 95-75. And then another 20-plus point game for Trine, beating Wash U Friday night, Matt. That was 86-65. And then one of the games of the tournament.
Wow.
One of the all-time games of any tournament, Matt. Trine gets an 88-86 win over UW Platteville in overtime. And this is the type of game, Matt, anyone associated with Platteville, this is the type of game that just haunts you down the line.
Yeah, I had to go back today to watch the last couple of minutes of this game because I was watching the Calvin game while this was going on, but just a completely nuts ending. I'll read through kind of my notes of the end here. UW Platteville was up by 3 points and at the free throw line for a 1-and-1 with about 2 seconds left. They miss the front end. Trine grabs the rebound, and Platteville fouls because there's only going to be about 1 second left, and you're down or you're up 3, so you foul to send them to the line for 2. Trine makes the first, so now with about 1 second left, down 2. They miss the second one intentionally, hoping to get a rebound. Drew Morf is at the line for Trine. He does not get blocked out. The rebound goes all the way to kind of the left-hand corner.
To the corner, yeah.
He tracks it down, and you got to get the rebound and put up a shot right away. Gets fouled in the act of shooting, about 0.9 left, right? Was going to be on the clock. So he's at the line for 2 more. He makes them both to force overtime. So we go from, in the last 2 seconds, Platteville's up 3 at the line to now Trine has made a free throw, desperation rebound, made 2 more free throws to tie it, and then they go into overtime. But that's not all. In overtime, the game is tied with about 8 seconds left. Trine inbounds the ball, comes down the court, and hits a long 2, a true buzzer beater at the horn to win the game. Their players are ecstatic. The crowd goes nuts. Trine wins the most improbable of games, almost that I can recall. I'm sure in all of the history of D3, there's other games that have been like this, but just absolutely nuts finish for Trine. Watching the broadcast, listening to the broadcast, it's kind of like they're almost in it's all over kind of mode as Platteville steps to the line. And then to go from that just a few minutes later to now we forced overtime, we've won the game. Just got to be an amazing feeling for Trine Thunder fans, for Trine Thunder players. And at the other end, you just have to feel gutted for Platteville and their supporters from feeling like this game is in the bag with 2 seconds left to now we've lost. Just the range of emotions you feel there is just incredible. It's tournament time. That's March. Just an absolute bananas finish here.
And here we get another one of those red highlighted numbers, Matt. Both Trine and Platteville, by the D3 Datacast computer, were favorites in their Sweet 16 round game. They match up in the sectional final, but Platteville was the favorite there, so a bit of an upset. Of course, Trine has that great home crowd. They've had great support from the Trine community, the Angola community, all year, and they're rewarded now just with a trip down the road to Fort Wayne. Matt, for the second time in 3 years now, we have an Indiana team make it to Fort Wayne to the Final Four. We saw what great support, all that red filing in for that semifinal game Wabash had against Elmhurst. And I expect that we'll see a similar scene in blue this time around.
Yeah. Fort Wayne's only a 20, 25-minute drive from Angola, Indiana. It's not very far. I do expect, yeah, that could potentially be like a Trine home game. So it'll be very interesting to see. Zach, one thing we talked about in this sectional heading into the weekend was how the four teams kind of appeared fairly even. But it was very interesting to me that Friday night ended up being two blowouts that we didn't really expect. There was that huge second half. I think Platteville scored 58 points on Case Western Reserve to win that game by a big margin. Trine kind of like beat Wash U by 10 in the first half and then beat him by 11 in the second half. And we kind of had two snoozers by the end of the game in the first weekend, and then we had that absolutely nuts finish on Saturday. Kind of how big of a difference one night versus the other can make. It ended up being a very fun sectional, but after Friday night, we were thinking like, man, this one, let's watch somewhere else around the bracket because these games were not very good. So just interesting the matchups that you get and what you can see from the results of the game.
Yeah, and we have more games to talk about here, but at the perfect time, I'll just jump in with one of my overall reactions from Friday, Matt, is that we only had one game that was a final margin within single digits, right? It's that very first game we talked about between Nebraska Wesleyan and Claremont Mudd Scripps. Everything else ended up a double-digit margin, despite some really what looked like on paper as like great matchups. We talked about that with Guilford and Keene State. We'll get here in a minute to Kelvin and Randolph-Macon. And just across the board, except for that one game, we saw double-digit margins, which was very surprising, I think, in the to be that deep into the tournament. And it's not like I don't think Matt, we're texting a little bit. Like it doesn't really feel like there was a dark horse making a run in this tournament, right? We have Sweet 16. We talked about some of the paths to the Sweet 16 to the second weekend were a little bit maybe quote unquote easier than others, but it didn't feel like there's this team that came out of nowhere, right? And so for that to be the case, sometimes you might see a team that has a run like that, and then, the clock strikes midnight, and all of a sudden back to reality. And you see one of these games that's double digit, or a favorite is coasting. I don't think we had matchups like that yet. We still had a bunch of I won't say non-competitive games, but games that ended up with double-digit margins, except for that one very first game of the day.
Yeah, we had done an episode, what was it, in January maybe, where we looked at potential dark horse teams who could make deep tournament runs. I think by the time, Rowan lost the Sweet 16 Friday night, Claremont Mudd Scripps also lost Friday night. By the time that those two teams had lost, we didn't really have anyone left that, we called it a dark horse team, teams that had not really been in the national poll, the national conversation much during the regular season. Once we got down to those Elite Eight type teams, we didn't have one of those teams left. And you don't, again, the dark horse is a dark horse for a reason. They're not expected to get there. You kind of often find someone along the way. But yeah, once we got down to the Elite Eight, we're like, man, these are, to a large degree, these are all teams that we kind of expected to be here or have a very good chance to be here, to be in the mix, to be here. And that's what ended up being the case. It's still just fascinating, you're right, that even in those types of games, you can have a bunch of these margins that end up 12 points, 15 points, 20 points. And then even the one that did, what was it? Nebraska Wesleyan, Claremont Mudd Scripps ended up, or Nebraska West, ended up 4 points. But, that was kind of a furious rally to get to that point. That one could have ended up like a 10-point margin as well.
One more group to talk about, Matt, here, hosted at Trinity, Connecticut. Calvin gets a 72-59 win over Randolph-Macon. That's the big highlight there, 22.7% chance, according to the D3 Datacast computer on that one. That was the lowest win probability to hit. But, Matt, another game where it was a double-digit margin, and Calvin really controlled it throughout. As good as Randolph-Macon is, I think this particular, while on paper or according to the efficiency ratings, it was an upset. It was a particularly bad matchup with their inability to handle Jalen Overway in the post. Sometimes it's just about matchups. It's not so much about just team quality, and we certainly saw that play out as Kelvin handled Randolph-Macon surprisingly easily, just in the way it played out. Later that night, Trinity, Matt, gets their third matchup, their third win over Tufts. It's kind of interesting to see. We talk about the quirk of the NESCAC and the single round robin tournament. or the single round robin in the regular season, but Trinity gets the regular season win, the conference tournament win, and then meeting up here in the national tournament for their third win over Tufts. That was a 70-53 score there. And then on Saturday night, Matt, Trinity gets the 69-62 win over Calvin. Matt, I'm proud of you. I'm proud of us putting on the brave face here about what, I don't know, 18 hours after Calvin gets knocked out on the doorsteps of the Final Four to put together our show for the week.
Yeah. Just talking about Calvin for a little bit. I'll jump up to that Randolph Macon matchup. That was a really impressive game for the Calvin Knights. Obviously, what ended up being a size and a length advantage for Calvin over the Yellow Jackets. They went inside to Jalen Overway. For much of the game, Randolph Macon didn't really have anyone who could match up with him. They didn't make his life too difficult. He scored 29 points in that game, had a double, really had his way with the Yellow Jackets. Credit to Randolph Macon, though, they didn't give up at halftime. Obviously, they made that a competitive game. There was a point, in the second half, getting fairly late, where they had cut that down to a 4-point lead. They were finding some ways to score. Jabril Robinson was getting into the lane a little bit. Daniel Mbange, even though he was usually guarded by someone bigger than him, was still tough in the paint, was making fall away jumpers in the lane, getting some points for Randolph Macon. But Calvin really responded once that got cut down to 4 points. I think it was an 8-0 run for Calvin to pull that back up to 12, and didn't kind of, once Randolph Macon made their best shot, Calvin really pulled that back away and put the game to rest. So I think credit to both teams, Randolph Macon for fighting back, Calvin for really saying, like, no, we're not going to let this game go. Really impressive game. My computer said that was the best game of Calvin's season based on who they were playing and how they performed. Just a really great matchup. That was one I didn't know how it was going to go. Definitely matchup advantage ended up being in Calvin's favor there. So great to see. The next night against Trinity was a little bit of a different story. I think Trinity used some of the mismatches that they had, not necessarily in size. I don't think Calvin is ever mismatched in the post in size, but they used a little bit of a quickness advantage to their favor. They really harassed the Calvin ball handlers, made life very difficult on Jalen Overway. Credit to Trinity for executing that game plan. I think they played very, very well. And credit to Calvin for the tournament run that they went through, starting with Elmhurst, then at John Carroll, then the neutral court game against Randolph Macon, then at Trinity. That was as tough of a 4-game stretch. That's probably the toughest 4-game stretch any team had. And for Calvin to get the wins that they did against John Carroll and Randolph Macon, and then to fight hard at Trinity as another true road game. I think that as a fan, as an alum of the school, I think I was just proud to see how the team handled themselves in this tournament run, getting some really great wins, never being outmatched. And, I think they showed that they are of a similar quality as of these other top national title teams. They have a young core. Calvin could do great things next year as well.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about to make a run to the Final Four, Matt, that would have had to have knocked off 3 of the top 5 teams in the latest D3Hoops.com top 25 poll, including 2 of those being true road games. So, as alums, proud, and I think it's impressive that they even got the shot at the third game there against a top 5 team. Worth mentioning too, Matt, you mentioned Jabril Robinson. He had been out for Randolph Macon since the ODAC tournament. He had missed the ODAC tournament and the first weekend of the national tournament with, I believe, a hand injury. He was back. So good for Randolph Macon to be, you're reaching the second weekend and back at full strength. But, all the more impressive to get that win for Calvin. And then you mentioned what Trinity did. Sometimes you get to this time of year and it's just like, you are what you are. And certainly, what Calvin does served them well in that game against Randolph Macon, right? Their identity, what they want to do, their strength with Jalen Overway in the middle is exactly what they needed in that matchup against Randolph Macon. And then turning around the next night, Trinity, on one hand, obviously was very prepared for that game, but also it's just what Trinity does, right? With that defense, with that pressuring the ball. And so just what they do, what they are, was better or was enough to get them that win that night. And that's just,
Yeah.
when you're getting into the tournament, you're playing teams that you may not be familiar with, and you don't have time to completely like reinvent yourself. It's just, you have to stick to what you do. We hear that a lot of times, and from coaches, whether it's interview on the QCast or Hoopsville, whatever. You just have to have your identity, lean into your identity, and play to the best of your ability. And I think we saw Calvin do that a bunch in this run. And here, they got knocked off by a Trinity team who fit that to a T, and
Yeah.
they're moving on to the Final Four.
Yeah, great weekend from Trinity. Their Friday night game against Tufts, that was a close game at halftime. In second half, Trinity just put the hammer down, locked Tufts down, took advantage both sides of the ball, really won that game kind of going away with an impressive win. Saturday night, one of the most effective game plans that we've seen a team execute against Calvin, against Jalen Overway, against the Calvin ball handlers. Trinity's defense is tenacious. I don't have the numbers in front of me. I'm sure by the computers they rank as one of the top 3 defenses. Certainly by the eye test, I think they rank as one of the top 3 defenses. They were really good. I think after watching this quadrant closely, they were the best team to come out of it. I know Randolph-Macon was the top seed. Trinity, out of all the teams in this group, Trinity is the team that I would least like to face going forward, and they're a deserving team into the Final Four. And I think that they're a competitive team going forward to Fort Wayne as far as who can win it all, right? I mean, obviously we have 4 teams that can win it all, but I would pick Trinity right up there as a favorite as well.
Matt, this quadrant has been the subject of discussion just because of the overall depth and quality. And when we talked about overall championship odds or the bracket odds right from the beginning of the tournament, I think we were both a little bit surprised to see that Trinity and Randolph-Macon had overall odds totaling about 70%, that one of the 2 of them would be moving on to the Final Four. But here, and so one of my predictions was that someone other than Randolph-Macon or Trinity would be coming out. I'd take the field in that 30%. Given that it included teams like NYU and John Carroll, and of course Calvin has been highly ranked all season. Tufts, while they fell off later, had been highly ranked earlier in the season. They of course knocked off NYU and got to the second weekend here. But yeah, credit to Trinity in the end. One of those favorites to come out of the quadrant is moving on.
Yeah, I think I read Hampton-Sydney's preseason or pre-tournament odds at 62%. Just to run down the other teams, Guilford, their pre-tournament odds to reach the Final Four was 18%. So they were a lot lower than Hampton-Sydney, 18%. They hit. Trine's Final Four odds to reach the Final Four was 10%. So they have now advanced. And Trinity was 35%. You mentioned they were one of the favorites in that quadrant, along with Randolph-Macon, fairly even odds. Trinity was 35% to get there, and they have now converted.
That gives us our Final Four, Matt. Hampton-Sydney and Guilford will meet in one semifinal. Trine and Trinity will meet in the other semifinal. So time to take a look at the deep dive here like we've done heading into other rounds. Matt, Hampton-Sydney, unsurprisingly, is a favorite in that matchup with Guilford. The computer likes them by about a 3.5-point margin. They have a 63% win probability to win that matchup with Guilford. And, you talk about what it takes to get here. These are certainly deserving teams. You look at Hampton-Sydney, the number 1 team in overall adjusted efficiency margin. They're doing it with elite offensive efficiency numbers, elite defensive efficiency numbers, ranked number 2 offensively, number 3 defensively. And, Guilford really not far behind, number 4 by the overall metrics in terms of the adjusted efficiency margin. Number 12 defense, the number 7, or excuse me, number 12 offense, the number 7 defense. So, the computer likes Hampton-Sydney as a solid favorite, but this is no slouch they're going up against here in Guilford.
Yeah, and I think an interesting dynamic these 2 teams face. Obviously, conference opponents, they know each other well, but I believe they only played once so far this season. The ODAC kind of does, I don't know, like a 1.5 times through the conference kind of a situation. So every team doesn't play every year twice. So they played at Guilford this year. Guilford won that game 80-71, and they did not meet in the conference tournament. So sometimes we saw like Trinity and Tufts, even though they only have the single round robin, that was their third meeting of the season. Here for Hampton City and Guilford, only their second meeting of the season. So they're familiar with each other, and Hampton Sydney's coach is a Guilford grad, but they haven't met 2 or 3 times already this season. So I think that'll make it somewhat of an interesting matchup here. One thing, again, I think this is teams like this, Hampton City, Guilford, Randolph-Macon, slow tempo type teams. This might only be like a 60 possession game. Like that was what the Calvin Randolph-Macon game was. It was only like 60, 61 possessions. So this one could be low scoring just because neither team's going to get the ball all that much. So always interesting to see how this shapes out. Neutral court game here. But yeah, as you said, Zach, only a 3.5 point difference between the two teams by the computer line. So two of the top teams in the country, going to be a very good game, expected to be a very good game. It'll be interesting to see what happens here.
And then in our other semifinal, Trine and Trinity. Matt, Trine is ranked number 27 overall by the D3 Datacast computer. The number 33 overall offense in terms of adjusted offensive efficiency margin, 39 defense. So a balanced team, but not quite as balanced in terms of, like top 10 ratings across the board, like we talk about with Hampton Sydney. But another area where they kind of stand out as a different team compared to the other three here, Matt, is their pace. Not a super fast team, right? Their overall tempo ranks 158th in the country. But when you're talking about teams that are like below 350, that make up the rest of the Final Four, Trine is one that maybe they're going to be looking to play or to push it even more, to push some teams into faster games than they want to play. So it'll be interesting to see what they choose to do, because Trine enters this as a pretty solid underdog against Trinity. 20% win probability, 80% for Trinity. The computer likes them by about a 9.5 point margin.
Yeah, so here it is on the screen. Trinity ranked the second overall defense by the computer. That's the best defense remaining. Fairly similar to Hampton Sydney's there. So it'll be interesting. Definitely an interesting dynamic. You sometimes hear the phrase "defense wins championships." I think that's largely true. Although Trinity's got a really good offense as well, so they're not just one trick, only defense, only kind of a team. I'll be interested to see. The computer sees this game as a bigger mismatch. Really likes what Trinity has together as a team. Doesn't see Trine quite that highly ranked or highly rated. Will be the second straight MIAA opponent for Trinity. But Trine's a very different team than Calvin is. They'll both play very tough defense. They'll both have identity a little bit more on the defensive side of the ball. But to me, Trine's scoring is a little bit more guard-oriented, where Calvin's is more post-oriented. So it's a different dynamic. I think Trinity can, just watching their defense, I think they can play against that type of a thing. But still, same conference opponent same conference that we just saw them play against Calvin, but a very different team in a lot of regards there.
Then looking ahead at potential championship game matchups, Matt, unsurprisingly, Hampton Sydney would be a favorite no matter who they play. The computer likes them by 11 should they beat Trine, and 1.5 should they meet Trinity. Trine would be an underdog in either game. We talked about that, 11-point underdogs to Hampton Sydney. They would be 6.5-point underdogs to Guilford. And then Guilford and Trinity are the two that are kind of in the middle. It's kind of dependent on the matchup. As we already mentioned, Trinity would be a 1.5-point underdog to Hampton Sydney, but Trinity would be a 2-point favorite against Guilford. And then just the last matchup there, Guilford would be a 6.5-point favorite over Trine.
Yeah, I think what we see, in both these kind of little graphics here on the screen is Trine enters as a little bit of an underdog, but we mentioned they're almost playing at home. So is that a factor? Is there going to be a Trine-centric crowd here against a team from North Carolina, a team from Virginia, a team from Connecticut? We're going to get the Midwest bias in Trine's favor. I don't know how that'll play out. But yeah, the computer really sees Hampton, Sydney, Guilford, Trinity to a large degree fairly even, very competitive games. Trine a little bit outside of that. But, if they can beat Trinity in round one, I think definitely anything could happen there. And if it was a Trine Guilford championship game, the computer sees that as a little bit tighter of a game there.
All right, Matt, our bracket is getting very, very narrow, but let's take a look just with one weekend remaining here at the overall bracket odds. We talked about Hampton City being a favorite. They're 62.8% chance to win here over Guilford. We talked about that one. Looking ahead, 38.5% odds to win the championship. In the other semifinal there, we talked about Trinity being a favorite, 80% odds to win that semifinal. Um, Actually, so Matt, this is showing Trinity as a 39.6% favorite actually to win the championship. Probably what that factors in is because they're more likely to win that semifinal game. They're more likely to reach the championship game and
Yes.
thereby have greater chance to win the championship game because they're more likely to actually be in it. So actually 39.6% championship odds for Trinity is actually the tops, followed by Hampton Sydney at 38.5. Guilford still very much, it would be less likely, but I don't think it would be a shock to see Guilford win at 17.9%. And we talked about Trine being a little bit more of the underdog of the four here. The computer odds give them a 4% chance to win the championship.
Yeah, you've caught me in some incorrect highlighting here. Even though the computer sees Hampton Sydney as the best team, you're right that it thinks that Trinity will have a little bit of an easier time, 4 times out of 5 advancing to the finals, whereas Hampton Sydney is more of like a 60-40 type first round or a Final Four matchup, Thursday matchup. So, but either way, I think computer says that those are the top two teams. Decent chance that the two top teams in the computer ratings maybe do face off here on Saturday. We'll have to see what happens. Guilford and Trine are going to have a lot to say about that. But yeah, interesting that those two odds, Hampton Sydney and Trinity, right now look fairly even to win the championship. But again, they got to play the games, and Trine and Guilford are going to have a say in that too.
Yeah, I think in the end we've got a really great field. I don't think there's any surprise team here
Yeah.
in the Final Four. We talked about there not really being a dark horse run into even the Sweet 16, certainly the Elite Eight, and therefore you're not going to have a dark horse team like we saw with a Whitewater, who was a bit of a surprise as a Final Four team last year, but made an impressive run and absolutely deserved to be in that Final Four field. So yeah, looking forward to it. I think we're in. I don't know that we could possibly top the 3 games we got in Fort Wayne last year, Matt. But we have 4 great teams. We're going to be in for 3 good games no matter what. We'll just see if they happen to come down to the wire like all 3 of those did a year ago.
Yeah, 2 years ago, we saw kind of 3 blowouts in the Final Four. We had a really great Randolph-Macon team, but they ran through both of their games, and then the other semifinal, Elmhurst ended up handling Wabash pretty well. Last year, though, we saw the opposite. We had 3 games that were they all ended up within a possession, or thereabouts, maybe 4. It was
Yeah.
They were all really tight, down to the wire every single game. It was great. When I was looking at these matchups for this season, my one thinking now that we're neutrals, you're right, our team is out, so we're just rooting for interesting games and interesting matchups. So my first thought is like, am I slightly disappointed or not that there's 2 ODAC teams? And then I kind of think like that was to me like the best league, at least at the top of the season. So I'm not surprised and really disappointed. I think I'm very interested in seeing both Hampton City and Guilford up close. So then my mind went to, okay, if we're going to have 2 ODACs, would I rather them be in opposite semifinals to maybe mix that up a little bit or get to the championship game? But then I realized I think I liked how this ended up. If we're going to have 2 teams from the same conference, let's put it in the semifinal so that way we know our championship game is going to be between 2 teams from different conferences. It's not going to be a conference championship game. I don't know if you have any opinions on that. That's kind of where I landed, just as a neutral, rooting for interesting storylines or interesting games, not really rooting for or against any of these teams here. Obviously our conference is represented here, so I think there's a part of us that, hey, if try and win and had a good showing for the MIAA, we'd be okay with that too. So I don't know if you had any thoughts of the kind of the ODAC-ness of this weekend.
Yeah, I think I hadn't given it too much thought. I mean, I think the first thing that, as you're explaining it that way, I think the first thing to remember is that the bracket was really set up for there to be potentially an ODAC final, right? Because Hampton Sydney was one of the number 1 overall seeds. On the opposite side of the bracket, another one of the number 1 overall seeds was Randolph-Macon.
Yeah.
So, and Guilford, they've been great all year. It's not really a surprise to see them in the Final Four, and this happened where they were placed happens to match them up with Hampton Sydney in the semifinal. But I think if you were looking at what the most probable ODAC matchup in Fort Wayne would have been, it would have been that championship
Yeah.
game matchup between Randolph-Macon and Hampton-Sydney. So it happened to be this way. I don't think it was necessarily set up for this to happen because Hampton-Sydney and Randolph-Macon were rightfully so. I'm glad they were on opposite sides of the bracket. But again, just being Division III basketball fans located in Michigan, the chance to see a high level ODAC game in person we're not likely to ever see that, right? So the fact that we get to go to Fort Wayne and in that semifinal, we're guaranteed to see a high level ODAC game is kind of exciting because it's not the type of game that we would have seen just in person based on where we're located. So I think that's kind of cool. Um, yeah, and Trine and Trinity, yeah, I think that's a really interesting matchup. Uh, it's funny to see both those teams listed with the number 3 next to their name. But yeah, I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to it. I think they're really interesting matchups, especially with Trine and Trinity. We've got all great defensive teams, but I think that Trine and Trinity do it a little bit more as a high pressure uh, type way, as opposed to just being slow down, stout defensively. Um, and so I think just in terms of the defensive styles being matched up here in the semifinal, I think is really interesting, and it kind of guarantees maybe a little bit of contrast in that championship game. Not like a total contrast of styles, but teams that all these teams can get it done defensively, but maybe do it in a little bit different ways. And so we're seeing a little bit more of the similarities matched up in the semifinal meeting, and then we'll get a little bit of contrast in the finals, no matter what happens.
So I think, I don't know if we've mentioned this, I think we have game times for these. Hampton City and Guilford will be Thursday at 5:30, and Trine and Trinity will be Thursday at 8 o'clock. That's what's showing on d3hoops.com, and I think that's correct.
We've talked a lot about it, Matt. I think we need to start making some picks about it.
All right, we'll run through last week's and then we'll get to this week. Here is our Sweet 16 picks, Zach. We had Nebraska Wesleyan as 3.5-point favorites versus Claremont Mudd Scripps. We all took the points with Claremont Mudd Scripps, but we were incorrect. Nebraska Wesleyan won that one by 4, and the line was 3.5. The next game was Christopher Newport against Williams. That was a half-point line in Christopher Newport's favorite. They won by 11. I get that point. Case Western Reserve was 1.5-point underdogs against Platteville. We both took Platteville and they won big, so we both get the point there. Wash U was 4-point underdogs at Trine. I went with Wash U. You went with Trine, and that was a 21-point game, so you get the point there as Trine wins big. Our game of the week ended up not being that big of a game, not that close of a game. We both took Keene State plus 3.5 points, but Guilford wins by 22, and we both miss that. So with just the Final Four weekend remaining, here is the overall scoreboard. Zach, you went 2-3. I went 2-3. So you maintain a 3-game lead. You are 51, 38-1 overall. I am 48, 41-1 overall. So I need a monster weekend to catch up to you. So here's this week's picks. Just a few games left.
One more slate, but we can't pick 5 games because there aren't 5 games remaining. So as we concocted for our last pick slate a year ago, we're going to do the same thing. We've got our semifinal matchups. We'll pick against the computer line as we normally do. And then, Matt, we each get to call our shot. We get to choose for 1 point each. We get a point each for calling which teams will make it to the championship game. And then 1 point for picking a winner, right? So 3 possible points for getting the finals matchup correct, as well as picking the correct winner.
So here we are picking against our computer line. We run these games through the efficiency ratings that our computer spits out. Guilford versus Hampton Sydney. Hampton Sydney is the 3.5-point favorite. Zach, what does your pick say?
I'm going with Hampton Sydney, although the way that Keene State game turned out gives me pause. Hampton Sydney's certainly been rolling, but in terms of like best win between these two in the tournament, I think you have to give that to Guilford. But Hampton City's been my number 1 team all along. I will keep going with them, even giving up the 3.5 points here.
Now, Zach, I'm going to have to try to win this pick'em contest. I'm 3.5 or 3 points down on you, so I'm going to have to make up some points. So I'm going to roll with Guilford plus the 3.5. I think that they can keep this within one possession, if not win it. So I'm going to pick Guilford here. I'm definitely was hoping that you would maybe take Hampton Sydney, and I'm going to try to go against you for the points. It'd be a tough one to pick if I was just having to pick actually myself. I might consider Hampton Sydney here, but I'm going to roll with Guilford and try to make up that point.
So no matter what you're saying is your pick was just going to be opposite me.
Well, yes, but I'm also trying to leave room for the fact that I can kind of go back and say that I was going to be right either way, because either I pick right or I'd say, well, I was only picking.
I think you've already given up your
So
cover. I think you've given up your cover. Sorry about that.
I'm trying to be right both ways. Okay, the second game is actually a huge line for the Final Four. Trinity is 9.5-point favorites against Trine. So which direction are you going to go, Zach?
I will take the 9.5 points here, Matt. Especially since we talked about where this game's located, where the campus of Trine University is located. I think that this will be, as much as it could be a home game for any team, it will be for Trine. According to what I've seen on social media, it looks like the Fort Wayne local media has been pretty well engaged into this tournament run. So Trine's been getting good local support all throughout.
Yeah.
But if the greater Fort Wayne Metroplex media system has been following this team and putting it on the radar of the local community, there might be even more just local Fort Wayne fans that maybe didn't even go to a Trine game earlier in this year that want to check it out. So I think this is going to be a really good Trine crowd. With a huge number like this, I will take those points every time.
I'm betting big here, Zach.
You're trying to catch up, so you're just picking against me.
I was hoping you'd go with a big number, because that's kind of what you've done most of the season. What we've both done most of the season. When there's big numbers, we get scared. I'm not going to get scared.
And then we get burned.
I'm not going to be scared. I think Trinity. I guess I'm predicting Trinity to win by double digits against Trine. So I don't know if Brooks Miller is going to put that on the bulletin board with the team, and maybe I'm going to get burned here, but I got to make up points here. So I'm going to go Bantams by 10 or more, and that's just what I'm going to roll with. So now we have to call our shot. What's your championship game matchup, and who's going to be your winner, Zach?
Okay, so obviously I've got Hampton Sydney because I picked them to cover the 3.5. I did pick Trine to cover the 9.5, but that leaves an awful lot of room, Matt. I'm going to go with Trinity to get the other semifinal win, and I will pick Hampton Sydney to lift the walnut and bronze on Saturday early evening.
Okay, so I'm really going to try to thread the needle. I think you had to do this last year with one of your picks, but I picked Guilford to cover 3.5. And I picked Trinity to win big. So obviously I'm going to pick Trinity. I'm going to pick Hampton Sydney to reach the finals. So a close Guilford loss. And then I'm going to pick Trinity to win the national championship. And I think I get all four of these correct, and I think I make up and I win the Pick'em challenge against you. That's how I see this weekend going. So I'm rolling hard with the Bantams this weekend. I'm fascinated to see these games, fascinated to see these matchups. I'm sure you and I are going to find a way to all get all of our games wrong in our picks as we see interesting games unfold in front of us.
Well, if I remember correctly, our picks contest came down to literally the final possession last year. I know I was also trying to thread a needle there in my call the shot last year, and which I did with Whitewater covering but losing, and then I had Mount Union in the finals, and Trey Barber dashed my hopes.
Yep. That's the picks.
All right, Matt. That's the picks. We'll see what happens. Looking forward to watching it all play out. Matt, we go on to the mailbag where we have one item here. It comes from Damian Jablonski, head coach at Whitworth. Matt, there's been a lot of talk about hosting and that sort of thing. So Hoops Coach Jay wants to know, how much does hosting statistically improve your chances of advancing out of this last weekend? It would be cool to see these regional pods win probability had the host been at neutral or away site. So, fun fact, the actual bracket odds that we've been presenting throughout this tournament run have all been actually based on, neutral
site odds. Yeah.
Neutral site odds. So they'd have to be adjusted actually from what we presented for hosting. But Matt, rather than get into a specific example from this weekend, I went through the process of putting together more of a theoretical situation. So if you had a pod,
a 4-team pod,
a four-team pod, like we see throughout the tournament, right? We see these four-team pods of perfectly even teams, right? So the computer sees them as exactly even teams. So the first game would be a neutral court game, and so these are perfectly even teams. So that's a 50-50 game, right? In the second game, these are perfectly even teams, but one's on the road, one's at home. And when we do the picks and everything, like the computer lines, Matt, you've built in a home court advantage of 3 points, right? So what that turns out to be is in terms of win probability, is that makes these perfectly even team matchups with the home road factored in a 61% win probability for the home team, a 39% win probability for the road team. Okay. So then, team one and two each have 50% odds of advancing out of that first game. Team three, in this case, has a 39%, right? Because they're perfectly even, but they're playing on the road, so they're at that road disadvantage. Team four has the home advantage, 61% odds to move out. Move on to round two, and you move on to round two. Team one and team two they're exactly the same team, right? So they have the same odds no matter who wins that first matchup. 21.6% odds to move out of the pod. Team three sees a 19.5% odds of moving out to winning that second round game. Team four, 37.2%, right? Because team four perfectly even in terms of efficiency rating to those other teams, but they're playing two home games. Whichever team comes out of that first meeting, team one, team two, if they're playing team four, that's road game. If they're playing team three, that's a neutral court game, right? So if this was all neutral court, they would all be 50-50 games. So in round two odds, it'd be 25, 25, 25, 25. So just having that one team have that potential to be a home game switches those odds from 25s across the board to 21.6, 21.6, 19.5, and 37.2%. So with decreased odds from 25% to 21.6%, that's an odds to advance decrease of 13.6%. That first team that has to play the road game in the opening round, since they have a less of a chance to move into the second round because they've got the disadvantage of playing a road game. That's why their number's a little bit lower. This is a little bit like the dynamic we saw, Matt, in the championship odds with, even though Hampton Sydney is the computer's number one team, Trinity actually comes out with a little bit of a better odds because they're more likely to actually reach that championship game, right? So in this example, those would be like team one and team two. So team three sees its overall odds decrease compared to just a fully neutral court situation of 22% decrease. And so the advantage for team four to be at home versus having this all be neutral is their odds to advance are 48.8% greater, right? Moving from 25% to 37.2% odds. That's an increase of 48.8%. So I thought doing that this way, we kind of simplify all the variables instead of trying to work with teams that have built-in advantages or disadvantages just because the computer sees them as better or worse. Here we're talking about all neutral teams or all even teams and comparing what it's basically just limiting the variable to one team having the advantage of possibly playing home games should they advance.
So one interesting thing I read out of this, Zach, and I like the way you laid this out, is it's a bigger advantage for the host than it is a disadvantage for the other teams. Obviously team three, who has to play the true road game in game one, so they always have to play a true road game. They have the biggest disadvantage. Their overall odds decrease by 22%, which is 5.5 percentage points. They go from 25% to just under 20%. So that's the biggest disadvantage, but that's only 5 percentage points decrease. The two teams that play the neutral, team one and two that play the neutral court first round game, their odds only decrease 3.5 percentage points overall from 25 down to 21.6. But then all those odd decreases basically go into the advantage of the home team. So they're up from 25% to 37%. So the other teams do have a disadvantage. But I just found it was interesting, and maybe this makes sense. I just didn't think of it this way. It's more of an advantage for the home team than it is really a disadvantage for the other teams. They're all kind of within, the range of where they were before. Obviously, the team that has to play the true road game is a little bit worse. But yeah, for that home team, that increases their chances almost 50%. Almost 12 and a half percentage points increase. So that's a pretty big deal to get those home games.
And even though we're not talking about it in specific terms of teams, Matt, the two on the men's side that we could talk about would be Randolph-Macon
Yeah.
and Case Western Reserve. In terms of seeding, those two teams would have been hosts. But the way that geography played out, what would have been the Randolph-Macon sectional gets played at Trinity. The Case Western Reserve sectional gets played at Trine. But it's important to note, Matt, I think in this discussion is both of those teams that lost out on hosting due to geography ended up not having to play the host that first game, but they were in that, team 1 or team 2 slot where they were forced into a neutral court matchup first. And really, both of them ended up losing in that one. It's not like they advanced out of that and then lost to the host.
Yeah.
So when you talk about it being more of an advantage for who's hosting rather than a disadvantage for who's not, like I don't think either of those teams were bounced because they were on the road. Now they lost out on the advantage of having the home court advantage.
Yeah.
But they were never even put in the position of having to play the host.
But then there's also further ramifications, right? What would have been the Case Western quadrant ends up at Trine. Platteville beats Case, but then they have to play a road game at Trine. So there is a ramification. Like maybe that would have been a neutral court game. Maybe without home court advantage, Platteville wins that game.
Right.
And then you're right. Maybe if Calvin played at Randolph-Macon, certainly that game could have been different. But maybe Calvin still does find a way to win a closer game there, and then they play Trinity on a neutral court. And maybe there is a difference there. Maybe there's not. But there's always those types of things, right? And I think in Division III, my personal opinion on the hosting, I would love more funding available and allocated in Division III to make more flights. So we could reward these hosts, or we could make more interesting brackets, or we could do a second weekend in Region 10 if there's a deserving host out there, or we could mix up the brackets so two teams from a Texas conference or from a California conference don't have to be in the same. I would love for that to happen. So I would love more funding there, but I don't want to see this hosting controversy, if it's a controversy, get solved with less creative bracketing. I don't want us to just force teams all regional within 500 miles so that always the second weekend works out. To me, as a fan of Division III, that's less fun. I would rather see a tournament that's more truly seeded, where sometimes the host sites don't work out according to the seeding, but the matchups are better and more diverse, than us get into more of a boring, more regionalized model that has to be less truly seeded in order to force everything to work within 500 miles so that those number one overall seeds always automatically essentially get that second weekend host.
I agree. Well said. All right, Matt, that was it for the mailbag this week.
I'm looking forward to a Final Four. Disappointed that my team didn't make it. Very happy to see the tournament run they did make. We've got 4 great teams here. Last Final Four weekend was excellent. I think this weekend's going to be the same. Just excited to see it.
Yeah, congratulations to the teams who made it. We can't wait to see you there in Fort Wayne. If you're a fan who's gonna be in town there, we'd love to say hi. Let us know. You can find us on social media. Leave a comment here. Let us know you'll be in town, and we'd love to say hello to you. And we would love to say thank you, Matt, to the people listed on the screen here. They've been our supporters on Patreon at patreon.com/D3 Datacast. They make everything that we do possible, Matt. We do this show. We have all the data, all the information on d3datacast.com with no paywalls, no ads. We really appreciate the support we've received all season and couldn't thank these people enough. But we do it every episode because they deserve it and more.
I can't believe we're already at the last weekend of the season. Thanks to everyone on this screen. Thank you for your support. If you haven't subscribed, hit the subscribe button below. That helps us out a ton. Zach, thanks for doing these episodes with me. Great job, team. Good job, teams that have made the Final Four this weekend. We'll see you.
See you in Fort Wayne.